Welcome to the show. In our last 3 episodes, we heard the heroic tale of Pedro Menendez de Aviles, the Navy admiral who finally succeeded where so many conquistadors had failed before and actually settled Spanish Florida. And in the 7 years since, Menendez demonstrated time and time again that he was the only truly gifted leader in the colony, which at its height had Spaniards living at 12 different areas from the Florida Peninsula to eastern Tennessee. But because of these successes, Menendez returned to Spain to receive a number of honors, titles, and new responsibilities, including the much coveted governorship of Cuba. And after this point, he is simply stretched too thin, and Spanish Florida lost 10 of its 12 places of Spanish occupation. Only Saint Augustine and Santa Elena remained. And just as Florida needed its leader more than ever, Menendez was called back to Spain to lead an armada against England. Then in 1574, going from bad to worse for the Spaniards in Florida, Menendez dies, which leads us into this episode, where everyone in Spanish Florida is wondering how the colony will survive without its governor. To answer that question, the Menendez family turned to his will, which gave his daughter Catalina the title of Adelantado of Florida. An adelantado is a person who expands the Spanish Empire into a new territory at their own expense and through their own efforts. In return, they are given hereditary rights to the position of governor, as well as a number of other revenue-generating privileges. It is a way for the Spanish king to extend his realms with minimal outflows from his own treasury. Now, Menendez did not intend for his daughter to actually rule as adelantado and governor, but rather her husband, Hernando de Miranda, which he could do in her name. Within a month of Menendez's death, Miranda has himself made his wife's power of attorney and assumes her inheritance. The couple then moves to have as many of Menendez's licenses and titles as possible transferred over to Miranda, who manages to secure the governorship of Florida, the promised revenue streams of being Adelantado of Florida, and the captain general position of the Western Fleet. Menendez was also governor of Cuba, but this position was not hereditary, so Miranda will have to go without. Menendez's will also took care of his widow and an illegitimate daughter, for whom he acknowledged. Both his widow and his illegitimate daughter were named Maria. Kind of an awkward situation. This second daughter would receive the right to make a private estate somewhere in Florida, about 24 square miles in size, a right Menendez had, but had yet to act upon before his death. Lastly, his nephew Pedro Menendez Marquez received the rights to settle the Panuco region of Spanish Florida, which will benefit his branch of the family for some time to come. And now, Hernando de Miranda rushed off to Florida to assert himself as governor, only to find that his brother-in-law, the husband to Menendez's daughter Maria, serving as acting governor. His name was Diego de Velasco. He had long served as a competent captain to his late father-in-law. When Miranda arrives at Santa Elena, the capital of Florida at the time, and not Saint Augustine as you would think, Velasco immediately hands over power to his brother-in-law, who then arrests Velasco and his wife Maria for misappropriation of funds, where they were reportedly held without option of bond and were underfed. It's interesting here, we don't really get the female point of view in these early stories and chronicles and records, but perhaps this little episode would demonstrate some friction between the legitimate daughter and the illegitimate daughter. Just a personal thought here. But concerning the brothers-in-law, Miranda accused Velasco of using Menendez's private assets to pay the soldiers of the colony and himself when the Situado, a yearly subsidy, did not arrive. Now here's where things get a bit hinky. Miranda in the past served as treasurer for Florida and had intimate knowledge of how integrated Menendez kept his own personal finances with that of Florida and of his Western Fleet. The historian Amy Bushnell writes of this situation, "For the first 11 years, it was hardly a treasury at all. Its books were tied first with the personal accounts of Menendez, then with the subsidy to the Indies fleet. When Florida received a subsidy of its own, the Adelantado and his numerous nephews treated it as part of their own personal funds." And I will add, moving forward, satisfying the pay of the soldiers with one fund and then paying it back when the Situado arrived would become a common practice in the future. You don't want your soldiers to be upset. Essentially, Miranda arrested Velasco for using funds in a manner that had already become practice in Florida, and everyone knew it. However, the colonists at Santa Elena had larger problems as the food supply was running out. Many wished to leave, but they didn't really have the means to do so. Miranda takes a few ships to Cuba to obtain supplies, and he puts Captain Solis, likely a relation to Menendez's wife, in charge as interim governor. Solis takes it upon himself to send 22 soldiers to the nearby Arista people to trade for food. The men are elated when they arrive, and they find that the Arista are in the middle of a grand feast. The starving men's stomachs turned over at the sight of the wild game, seafood, and corn dishes. But the Arista denied them any food. The Spaniards grew rabid and they chased the Arista out of their own village and began stuffing their faces. The chief then later approached the men and asked for his village back. The men responded that they never wanted the village, but that they were starving and they needed food. The villagers, of course, could return. The chief then told the Spanish that they would only return if the Spanish put out their fuses on their guns. Guns in this era required a burning wick to touch off a pan of powder. The flintlock was already invented, but it was cumbersome, much to be improved upon, and not yet widely used. The Spanish, feeling some guilt, agree to extinguish their fuses, and with this, the Arista warriors fall upon the men, killing all but one, who's hunted all the way back to Santa Elena, making it back alive to tell his tale. The settlement was now down 21 soldiers, gained not an ear of corn for their loss, and made an already tumultuous relationship with the Arista far worse. Governor Miranda returns with some food, but is ill-equipped to deal with the situation unfolding because the Arista, in league with their allies, the Gulle people, now held a long siege on Santa Elena. On July 22nd, 1575, 9 Spaniards are murdered outside of Santa Elena, tending to the colony's hogs. A day later, the natives close in, perhaps 500 strong, and they reach the walls of the fort at Santa Elena. The garrison is down to just 20 soldiers. Governor Miranda makes the decision to abandon the settlement. They quickly evacuate and they flee by boat to Saint Augustine, which is now the sole settlement of Spaniards in so-called Spanish Florida. Saint Augustine itself was still recovering from a hurricane the year before that destroyed about half the town. It was in a pitiful condition, and here any of the settlers from Santa Elena who had the means to leave Florida for Cuba tried to do so, which proved difficult as the Gulle natives, angered by Governor Miranda's execution of a man who killed a Catholic chief, were now attacking the ships close to the coast. And in one incident, the natives kill a nephew and namesake of Pedro Menendez himself, known as Pedro Menendez the Younger. As the walls seem to be closing in on the Spanish, the Situado subsidy finally arrives. Governor Miranda has some resources. He has this chest containing the Situado placed on a ship. He then appoints his own brother, Gutierrez, to be interim governor, and then Miranda leaves Florida with the subsidy, taking the money all the way back to Spain, where he is arrested upon his arrival. Meanwhile, a royal inspector visiting St. Augustine reports to the crown that every official in Florida is guilty of something. And based on this report, Governor Miranda is accused of stealing royal property, mishandling the Situado, he is blamed for the loss of Santa Elena, and he is accused of confiscating letters written by the colonists. All of which are likely true, by the way. Miranda just about disappears from the historical record after this point. It's safe to say he faced some punishment, and he was never again trusted with any significant authority ever again. We can certainly say that Spanish Florida, under Hernando de Miranda's short tenure, reached a new low since its founding in 1565. But back in Florida, interim governor Gutierrez de Miranda, perhaps under the direction of his brother, did in fact ban all outgoing mail from the colony, which was essentially a prison, with around 200 colonists unable to write to the outside world, without the ability to travel by land or sea as the Gulle continued their attacks. Anyone with the ability to leave having already left. One of these brave souls who managed to get out smuggled a bunch of letters out in a jar of salt. This is how the plight of the Spanish in Florida became known to the Council of the Indies in the process of dealing with Hernando. Now the King of Spain, in keeping with his general plan to better integrate his empire, took this as an opportunity to take away the inheritable adelantado position from the Menendez family and made Florida a royal colony. Nevertheless, after Pedro Menendez's two failed son-in-law governors and Gutierrez, his nephew, Pedro Menendez Marquez, is made governor of Florida, a man far more like his uncle than any of these in-laws. Marquez had long worked for his uncle, settling Florida, governing Cuba, commanding the fleet of the Indies, all when his uncle was away. He would now resign from the fleet and become governor of Florida. And now the job of governor would be fundamentally different than in previous episodes of this podcast. This season began in the era of the conquistadors, and the frontier of the Spanish Empire expanded through conquests, fueled by personal glory. The King of Spain, now having that expanded empire, no longer desired the likes of Hernando de Soto or Ponce de Leon, conquering new frontiers in a wanton fashion with no enforceable restrictions. Rather, governors were now to be employees to the crown, who would rotate out every 5 or 6 years ideally, and seek to develop the vast lands they now oversaw. Expansion, in theory, would continue slowly through the peaceful conversion of natives on the frontier. Of course, this would be more an ideal than a reality. In early 1577, Governor Marquez with 50 soldiers arrived at Saint Augustine, again, the sole settlement of Spaniards in Florida, with a population of only about 210 individuals, themselves mostly soldiers. A sorry sight, but the native attacks had abated a bit. As it turns out, during this year and the last, the natives of Florida were hit by a devastating plague. Estimates vary, but on the high end, scholars think over 1 million natives died during this short period from the Florida Peninsula deep into the mainland, which the Spanish on their maps still included as part of their Florida, despite being violently rejected from the area years ago. The king tasked Governor Marquez with building a new fort at the site of the abandoned Santa Elena. However, the area still remained full of hostile natives, so Marquez had the idea to construct a simple fort out of sturdy cedar wood in sections at Saint Augustine. Then he tasked former Governor Gutierrez de Miranda, still remaining at his military post, with transporting it quickly to Santa Elena and assembling it in pieces before the natives took notice. Surprisingly, Miranda manages to pull this off, and the fort is named Fort San Marcos, not to be confused with the later Castillo de San Marcos. This new fort was built about 150 feet from the old Fort San Felipe and was somewhat more impressive in size. With Santa Elena now well defended and St. Augustine put back together, Governor Marquez spends 1578 into 79 violently subduing his native enemies, primarily the Ayas, the Gullah, and certain Timucua chiefs. His go-to move, well honed under his uncle, was to burn fields of maize just before each crop was fit for harvest. Between the plague and the forced famine, the natives, not already friendly with the Spanish, were finally beaten back from St. Augustine and Santa Elena, at least for now, and in doing so, the Spanish found fighting with the natives survivors of French Florida, a Huguenot colony, mostly massacred by Pedro Menendez in 1565. Most of these survivors were then slated for execution. Many Spanish chroniclers blame these Frenchmen living in the woods, having gone native, so to speak, for turning the natives against them, rather than consider the actions of the Spanish themselves in Florida, which more than likely explains all of the problems the natives would have with them. Having pacified the Upper Peninsula of Florida, Governor Marquez now turned to financial matters, always a mess in Florida. Florida, formerly a proprietary colony, as previously mentioned, used the Adelantado's funds to support its officers and officials. Now, as a royal colony, officials would be allowed to take half their pay directly from the Situado. The other half would have to be raised by the normal sources of colonial revenues, such as licenses for merchant boats and commercial activity, notary fees, official paperwork, the sale of seized contraband, and eventually, starting in 1580 for Florida, a tax on exports. But Florida, throughout its entire history, and especially at this point, had very little economic activity for the officials to siphon funds from. And many of the posts in Florida will eventually just land in the hands of residential Floridanos families, especially positions in the Florida Treasury. These posts will become hereditary and coveted by any Spaniard living in Florida. But any Spaniard not living in Florida could easily earn more money as a treasurer elsewhere. In other words, the pay in Florida was substandard. But the king at this time also increases the situado to pay for up to 300 soldiers spread between the two settlements. Moving forward, the soldiers' pay from the situado will be the primary economic force of the colony for some time to come. In our last episode, I compared Spanish Florida to any American military town today, dependent on money coming out of a local base to survive. Governor Marquez also had his work cut out for him just obtaining supplies. Spanish ships simply were not in the habit of visiting the young colony, and even if they were in the area, they didn't want to navigate the shifting sandbars of Saint Augustine just to try to sell their goods in a colony that was relatively poor compared to other places like nearby Cuba. They'd much rather just continue on their way. The governor would sometimes post a ship off Cape Canaveral to entice traders on the spot. And then he would have to send out agents, and sometimes he would leave in person to obtain supplies from Havana or Veracruz. But authorities in these colonies often saw Florida as a drain on their own, and either denied access to their markets or, seeing the plight of the Spanish in Florida, charged extremely high prices both for the goods and to ship those goods if the governor did not provide his own ships for all the supplies. Governor Marquez would often resort to just sending ships to Spain proper, where the abuses were minimal. With basic governance established, the natives subdued for now, and Santa Elena reestablished, Spanish Florida, under Governor Marquez, began to resemble the colony as it was under his late uncle before his in-laws were allowed to let everything fall apart. The fruit trees and the maize fields outside of the settlements returned to their former state. The Spanish experimented with wheat and cassava, but the native maize would eventually become the carb of choice. And even still, the colony had yet to become self-sustaining, which is why these supplies coming in were so important. But there was little hints of progress in this direction. The first cattle ranches took off in the 1570s, and the friendly natives began trading deerskins with the Spanish. Now, deerskins, while not as valuable per pound as beaver skins found to the far north, were useful for their leather and became a chief export of the colony, while some supply remained in the colony for locally made products like shoes, for which Saint Augustine could now have cobblers to make. The colony also began exporting tar and pitch, as well as juniper and sassafras, thought to have medicinal qualities. And all around St. Augustine, people were experimenting with growing different varieties of grapes and melons and vegetables. Still, the colony remained a quaint affair. Under the adelantado system, the governor had the responsibility and many incentives to recruit colonists to populate these settlements that he himself had some ownership over. Now, as a royal colony, there just wasn't anything to be personally gained by investing in recruitment. As such, many of the incoming Spaniards from this point on will be military men, and sometimes their families, taking up posts at, again, St. Augustine or Santa Elena. The single military men, of course, could be enticed to stay given that they married a local Spanish woman or a Catholic native. In 1580, 44 married Spaniards arrived with their families to the colony. But these things were cyclical. Once the assignment had ended, the entire family would likely leave unless members therein formed an attachment locally. By 1581, even Governor Marquez grew tired of Florida and he wished to return home to Spain. But rumors filtered through the transatlantic world that an Englishman by the name of Sir Humphrey Gilbert sought to plant a colony along the east coast of North America. Spanish Florida, at its genuine inception in 1565, was created as a defensive outpost on the frontier of Spanish America, and indeed was only successfully settled after the discovery of a secret French colony on the East Coast. More than ever, the empire needed Governor Marquez to stay on. But the most immediate threat proved once again to be the French. The Spanish extracted many Frenchmen over the years from among the natives, as previously mentioned. Most of these men would be executed, one of which was a man named Nicolas Strozzi, whose death was particularly unfortunate for the Spanish as he was the cousin of Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother of France. Such a man could have easily have been ransomed for a tidy fortune that could have fed some colonists and soldiers, perhaps. This was a common practice at the time to ransom off wealthy individuals caught in a time of war, but the Spanish in Florida had made it known that it was their practice to provide no quarter to interloping Frenchmen, with rare exception. Now here in 1580, the French still sought to trade with the natives for their skins along the St. Johns River, and were furthermore looking for the Queen Mother's cousin. Governor Marquez, following up on rumors of their presence, commands 2 frigates to the vicinity of the former fort, San Mateo, defying the French here quite willing to fight in their larger galleys. I hope I'm saying the name of that ship right. A galleass. Galleass. You pick the way you want to say it and leave me alone. The 2 enemies exchanged broadsides, and then the Spanish grappled the French ship, leading to an intense, close-quarters fight, more with swords than firearms. The French, sensing the futility of their plight, intentionally wrecked their ship along a nearby shoal, hoping to take the Spanish ships down with them. 1 Spanish frigate is wrecked with the French ship, but Governor Marquez breaks his grappling just in time to avoid bottoming out. 54 Frenchmen died in this engagement, 18 Spaniards. This event became known as the Battle of San Mateo, and was certainly a victory for the Spanish. However, the French continued to incite the natives in the area, leading to about 3 years of war between the Spanish, the Galle, and the Arista, ending with their submission to the Spanish and a yearly tribute to be made in corn. The Spanish never really managed to create an encomienda system in Florida, and subservient chiefs mostly treated the Spanish governor like a paramount chief, something they knew well, where one chief held sway over the others and extracted tribute in return for protection, but otherwise left each chiefdom pretty much alone. Now keep this in mind, because in future episodes, when we talk about the different provinces of Spanish Florida, mostly these will consist of native semi-Catholic societies only mildly governed by authorities in Saint Augustine. But the beginning of this arrangement really begins right around 1583, which would prove to be a year ending with a general peace among the Spanish and the various natives of Florida. This is when Governor Marquez formalized his tribute system in the native fashion to those he defeated, and continued the tradition of mutual gift-giving with his allies, which was a native tradition already. And at the time, about 80 natives from the nearby villages came to the town every Sunday for Catholic Mass. This would be the genuine beginning of conversions of the natives in Florida, which up to this point created more dead priests than living Catholics. Moving forward, it'll be a little more successful. And then, just a year later, an old ally, the Patano tribe of the Timucua, surprisingly began raiding the Spanish and their native allies. We don't really know why they started doing it, and we can't really say that the Spanish were blameless for starting this conflict. But Governor Marquez sent Gutierre de Miranda to counter these attacks. He again burns the fields of maize, he kills about 20 of the Patano, and forces them to move westward out of the Spanish periphery. There would now be a general peace in Florida, at least for the short run. I know, it keeps breaking down. Governor Marquez also discovered the Coquina Stone on Anastasia Island. In the future, this stone will be mined to build many of the fortifications and the prominent buildings of Saint Augustine, some of which survive to this day and are iconic. The colony also received at this time 30 crown slaves to carry timber from the forests to the city to further strengthen their defenses. A crown slave was an enslaved person of African descent, officially owned by the crown. They were set to work on public service projects, but could be rented by private individuals for their labor. Spanish Florida will be known in a later time as a haven for those running away from enslavement in the English colonies, but it did have its own population living under enslavement. Popular accounts tend to overlook this fact. The Spanish would be inclined to emancipate a person running away from enslavement under an enemy, such that it would weaken them, but would still have their own enslaved population. So just keep that in mind moving forward. We're not going to whitewash history here. In total, it becomes clear that almost all of the industries, folkways, governmental institutions, labor institutions that will become traditions in later Spanish Florida were pretty much already established under not Pedro Menendez, but under his nephew, Governor Pedro Menendez Marquez. And by 1585, Marquez again felt his work was complete and he wished to return to Spain and to a nice retirement. After all, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, as everyone now knew, was dead, having been lost at sea after claiming Newfoundland for England. Such a remote place, the Spanish had already realistically written out of their domain. And in fact, early on, Newfoundland fell under the Portuguese claim based on errors in map-making and geography at the time. But then literally, as the governor prepared to depart, he received reports of another Englishman, Sir Richard Grenville, a cousin of Humphrey, privateering in the Caribbean. Governor Marquez again could not bring himself to abandon the colony his family sacrificed so much to create. And again, he stayed, which may have been for the best. Because in late May of 1586, an Englishman named Christopher Carlisle lands a small force and he takes over the unfinished fort known as San Juan de Pinos, the Spanish having fled without much of a fight for Saint Augustine. The English decided such skittish men might be worth pursuing, even if the English force remained small in number. They chased the Spaniards until one of them turned around, shot one of the Englishmen, and then finished him off with a knife. That was enough to send the English back to the fort. Now, Governor Marquez had questions. Why had the English come just to occupy an unfinished fort? Why had they not attacked St. Augustine? Or why had they not shown up with sufficient forces to do so? Most of all, it was quite curious that the English continued to occupy the fort, seemingly without any obvious reward to be had. Let's say they were looters. You could take whatever's in the fort and leave. That time had already passed. Answers to his questions came when a mighty fleet was sighted off the coast. One of the greatest gifts and curses of St. Augustine was its difficult-to-navigate inlet, which hindered transportation and trade, but also stalled the progress of an invading fleet. The governor saw no other option but to abandon St. Augustine, and he marched the entire population of 400 or so people, about 150 being soldiers, away from the city to the former site of San Mateo, Fort San Mateo that is, on the St. Johns River. A bit more inland and hidden away, 21 years prior, his uncle had taken a similar trek from St. Augustine, but at that time he led a force of soldiers to Fort Caroline, a French Huguenot fort, and the original name of Fort San Mateo. Pedro Menendez then slaughtered the Huguenots and effectively ended French Florida, a brutal and yet stunning victory. Governor Marquez, here in 1586, is making the same trip as his uncle, but with the opposite effect. The large English fleet was commanded by Sir Francis Drake, who was some degree of cousin to Sir Humphrey Gilbert. Christopher Carlisle's force was just a single detachment of what Drake had. Drake used the guidance of a Huguenot survivor to find St. Augustine, and Carlisle, by occupying the fort, closed off the closest place for refuge for the Spanish. Drake made the abandonment of the city logical and inevitable for Governor Marquez. With this, Drake burns St. Augustine to the ground. He burns the farm fields. He cuts down the groves of fruit trees. Some of the locals even joined in to make sure the job was complete. And each party carried off any loot that could be found along the way, including the pay for the entire garrison and a large number of very large artillery that couldn't be dragged to San Mateo. All of the records of the city were burned. Drake's map of St. Augustine is thus the earliest surviving map of the city, the first permanent European city in the continental United States. It was now reduced to complete ruins. More ash than wood. Men like Drake, Gilbert, and Grenville were all West Countrymen, which to the English made them heroes and merchant adventurers. But to the Irish, they were invaders. And to the Spanish, they were pirates and raiders. The people of St. Augustine lay in wait inside of the remains of Fort San Mateo, overrun by the natives years before. The superior English force need only have interest in seeking them out, and it would all be over. Spanish Florida would be no more, and all they could wish for was better treatment from the English than the Spanish had given the French on that very same spot. Drake makes his way out of St. Augustine, taking his fleet up the coast, closer to Fort San Mateo. He finds the cedarwood fort San Felipe at Santa Elena, a little closer to the ocean proper. Unable to negotiate a safe landing, he actually just loses interest. and he continues on to the north, to a land the English now referred to as Virginia. A messenger from Santa Elena informs the people at San Mateo that the English had moved on. The dread had lifted. Spanish Florida would continue on, and their lives were spared. Governor Marquez leads his people back to Saint Augustine, a smoky shell of its former self. 21 years of progress ripped away in 3 days. And yet they resolved to rebuild. When Governor Marquez began his tenure here, the small population mostly sought ways to escape Florida. Now here, under the worst of hardships, his sturdy group sought to begin again. This population will become the core of the Floridanos, a term used for the Latin American population of Spanish Florida, having their own distinctions from the rest of the Spanish Empire. Florida, for these few, was more than a temporary assignment. It would become their home, community, and identity. Governor Marquez again stayed on. No decent leader would abandon his flock at a time such as this. And there were still questions to be answered. Why were the English so suddenly willing to expend resources to wipe away a city that provided them no threat, had little to be looted, and could have otherwise have gone unnoticed? The Spanish had their suspicions that the English now had a secret colony in North America, and they were right. History will remember this colony as Roanoke. And keeping with the theme of this podcast, in our next episode, we will learn about this colony. Not the lost colony of Roanoke, but the first colony of Roanoke. Stay tuned. This has been the Other States of America History Podcast. I'm Eric Yanis. Thank you for listening.